Hello, and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. Today, we bring you Bookshelf, an episode dedicated to the books we're each reading outside of book club, the ones we get to pick and choose.
On my list, I have The Midnight Library, Matt Haig's uplifting, poignant novel about regret, hope and second chances, and Miss Iceland by Auður Ólafsdóttir, a mid-century portrait of a young female writer that recently won the Icelandic Bookseller Award.
And on my list, Parisian Lives, biographer Deirdre Bair's memoir of writing about Samuel Beckett and Simone de Beauvoir, and the latest instalment of Deborah Levy's living autobiography, Real Estate.
Keep listening to hear what we thought of them, and to see if there's anything here that could tempt you away from your TBR pile.
All that coming up, here on the Book Club Review.
So Kate, it's been a while.
Yeah, and I'm dying to hear about both your books. One, which I've never heard of. The other one, The Midnight Library, I feel like I've heard a lot about. It's very well reviewed. Lots of people seem to have read it. Lots of people seem to really, really, really love it. And I've always been quite curious. I'm kind of slightly wary in that way that I am of books that lots of people seem to love. I kind of hesitant, maybe in case I don't like it. I don't know. But anyway, for whatever reason, I have it, but I haven't read it yet. Should I?
Well, let's discuss. I should tell you that this was a birthday present that became a present full stop. My dad confessed to me that he had bought me a book for my birthday in early April and that he had read it. And I said, wait a second, you can't buy me a book for my birthday, read it, and then gift it to me. And he said, oh, okay, well, then I'll just give it to you.
That's the sort of thing that I would do, just so you know.
So he just gave it to me before my birthday, and I read it kind of in one weekend. It's that kind of book. So, The Midnight Library. On the cover it says, one library, infinite lives. And the premise is that Nora Seed is very much in the depths of a dark, depressive moment in her life. She's having an awful time in her personal life, in her work life, and she's having a particularly bad day when she's already depressed, and she decides to take her own life. She takes pills and she ends up in this in-between space called the Midnight Library. And there she meets Mrs. Elm, who was the librarian in her school, who was an important figure in her childhood and young adult years because she kind of created a safe space for Nora. And Mrs. Elm is there to help her navigate this library. And every volume in this library, and there's infinite volumes, is a life that she could have lived if she had made different decisions. It's a hook. I think it's a commercial hook. I think that's why it's had so much cut through in terms of initial marketing and attracting attention. It's also a hot topic, I think. Matt Haig is best known for his nonfiction books. And the one that's on my radar, but I haven't read, is Reasons to Stay Alive. Have you read that?
No, but I was going to ask how much of it is autobiographical, because the one thing I know about Matt Haig is that he was once in that place himself, was he not? And that he managed to come through it and now is this incredibly successful author.
Yeah, it obviously comes from his own experience and ongoing commitment to educating people about mental health issues and helping people navigate. I know that he has a huge following on Twitter where he tweets about mental health and his own, I think, ongoing challenges. And so from that setup, as you might imagine, we are taken into all these lives that Nora could have lived. And it's sort of a weird sci-fi premise because she arrives in these lives and she has no recollection of the life. And so there's like, I'm going to say an onboarding process. That's because I've got my work hat on right now. There's this process every time she arrives in a new life where she has no idea what's going on. She's not going to be able to perform in the way that the normal Nora would.
Is it like Quantum Leap?
Yes, it's exactly like Quantum Leap. And I only know that because Adam explained that to me. I told him about it.
Did you not ever?
No, I've never come
Did
across
you not watch
Quantum Leap.
No.
No.
Oh my goodness. Our listeners might not know Quantum Leap. Quantum Leap was an 80s series where this character, male character, can't remember his name, but exactly that. He used to jump into different lives. I guess the point was they weren't his life, they were other people's lives. And there was always this hilarious reveal moment where he would look in a mirror And it was often funny. He'd be like a little old lady or, something. But it was always like a real, not what you'd expect.
Yeah, so the only real difference here is that she is still Nora Seed and she is experiencing a life that could have been hers. This book is really about regrets. And so Mrs. Elm, this sort of master of the library, is asking her to think about regret and what she would have liked to have done differently and where would that lead her. I should say that when she arrives in that life, it's at the exact same moment she left. For example, she was a very successful competitive swimmer when she was a teenager. And one day she decided to stop. She didn't want to do it anymore. And so one of her regrets is what could have been if I had stuck with swimming. And so Mrs. Elm guides her to a volume. She puts her hands on it. And she is that Olympic medal winner. She is a competitive swimmer. She has won medals for Great Britain. And she is now giving an inspirational talk to all the people who have come to hear her and learn from her. It does get a little bit formulaic, as you might imagine, because she dips in and out. I didn't love this book, but I was reminded of how easy reading can be sometimes. And I don't know about you, but I have a real double standard when it comes to fiction versus television. I am willing to suspend my disbelief when it comes to television and film. Like, I have no expectations of like consistency or that this should be sensible, that this Midnight Library should make sense. And like, why can't she remember things? And have you really thought this through, Matt Haig? And actually, TV film, I just let it wash all over me because for me, that's a bit more escapism. Whereas when I read fiction, yes, I'm trying to escape, but I'm kind of like, I don't know. I'm a bit of a stick in the mud, I suppose.
I think with reading, as a reader, you complete the work. The author gives you the words and they give you the story, but it's up to the reader then to generate the images and fill it in their mind. And I think it's a much more active dialogue between the text and the person reading it. When you're watching something, you can just sit there and let it wash over you because someone else has already done all that work. The director and the cinematographer and the actors and the costume designer, all those people have brought this thing to life for you. But when you read, it's up to you to do that. And I think as a result, yeah, definitely. If something maybe has little inconsistencies or things that don't quite work for you, I think it really can jolt you out of this world that you've gradually been building in your head.
I enjoyed this book, though, in the sense that it's like very undemanding. Like, it was a quick, easy, breezy read.
And there must be something about it that people are really taking to their hearts. I mean, when I see the way people respond to this book, when people write about it, is there nothing in it that kind of spoke to you in that way?
No. But you know me.
Laura, heart of stone Potter.
No, I guess I thought that the treatment of her mental health issues was a bit underdeveloped. I couldn't quite understand how she ended up where she was. I also thought that all the lives she inhabited, the woman who had got her to that point in that life was a completely different individual. And so for me, it almost wasn't comparable. It wasn't about decisions made. It was about, your basic personality because these other Noras were so different to her. And so I guess it just didn't ring true to me as much as it has to other people.
Yeah, how interesting.
I thought it was a little bit trite.
Is it that idea of regretting decisions that we've made and maybe that we shouldn't do that you should embrace?
Oh, definitely. But I guess that's what I mean about it being a bit trite. For me, it didn't feel like a very profound insight. It was like, don't regret anything because actually the life that you're living has taught you and brought you to a specific moment and you need to kind of go forth from that point. I will say the ending wasn't as predictable as it could have been.
Also, I think listeners should know that Laura is a very pragmatic person.
Yep.
And if something isn't working in your life, you look at it very objectively and you say, okay, how can we solve this problem? I mean, maybe people have this sense of you, I don't know, but this is absolutely what Laura is like.
Yep.
So I'm thinking a sort of slightly whimsical, but if only we'd turned that other corner and I wasn't really happy, but I didn't really do anything about it. That's never going to land with you, is it?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I live with many regrets in my life. And I think that's not necessarily because I've always done the right thing, but wherever I am, you're right, I'm looking to the future and thinking about what's next. I'm not looking backwards. And obviously that is a personal trait. And you're right. We're not all the same. Other readers might come to this book and it really resonates with them because of, their own experiences and musings and worries about decisions they've made.
I'm so interested to hear about it because obviously, it's very familiar to me, but I've never read it and I was curious.
And I was really happy that my dad bought it for me because
it was a good read, sounds like.
It was a good read and I wouldn't have read it otherwise. And now I feel like I'm a part of that conversation around this book.
So even though we've been incredibly critical of it, it was a good read.
Yeah, and, I think
You had
it
a
might
nice
be-
time reading it.
I think it might be a good book club book because it's quite an easy read, it's somewhat thought-provoking, and actually it would tease out how people feel about these issues. As a springboard for broader conversations, it could be quite interesting, even though I don't think you'd really get into the literary nuances of the writing. I'm not sure those are there.
Are any of her other lives set in Paris?
No, I don't want to give it too much away. I think you should read it. We could have a follow-up call.
I was asking because I'm looking for some kind of segue, but there isn't one really at all to link to my book, which is called Parisian Lives. Lives, different lives, people's lives. There you go.
Yeah, okay.
From
there
hypothetical lives to real lives.
in Paris.
Yes, Parisian lives. Once again, I can't quite remember why I came to read this, but someone somewhere had written about it, and I was intrigued at the time, and I had ordered it at the library. And finally, suddenly, in that brilliant way that books come from the library, it just suddenly appeared. It's by a biographer, but it's her memoir of writing 2 specific biographies. And these were the biographies that made her name. So one was of Samuel Beckett, and the other was of Simone de Beauvoir. And she was quite young at the time when she approached Beckett. Her PhD thesis was on Beckett's work. And in that research and that academic work that she was doing, she came to realise that a lot of people were analysing Beckett's work. Like there was this whole body of scholarship. But it was all coming from quite a theoretical position because people just didn't really know much about him. And so as a result, all this criticism was interesting, but it was very abstract. And she felt that from the work itself, there must be personal things that were embedded within it. She wanted to fill what she saw as a gap in the existing scholarship on him. And so she wrote to him, and in a way that, looking back on it, this whole memoir was written at the end of her life, and she's looking back on this period when she wrote these books. And in a way that later on seemed to her totally brash and she couldn't believe she did it. But at the time, she just wrote to him and explained her reasoning and said, this is my impression of the work that exists and what I think is needed. Would you let me write your biography? And to her complete astonishment, this famously difficult and reclusive individual wrote back and said, if you come to Paris, I will see you. And then she went to Paris and she met him. And they had a discussion and she felt terribly awkward and he wasn't particularly warm or friendly. It was quite difficult. But at the end, he said, I will neither help nor hinder you. My friends and family will assist you and my enemies will find you soon enough. And with that, he kind of gave her his blessing. And so she then sets off to start researching him. And so you get this real insight, this first-hand insight into her interactions with him directly, because every once in a while they would meet and he was terribly difficult with her. She would let him know when she was going to be there and he would keep her waiting for a week and then finally answer a little telephone message. Or I found out, this is full of all these really fascinating details as well. I didn't know, but I found out in Paris they had a pneumatic messaging system.
Oh, yeah.
They were called pneumatiques, so it was les pneus bleus or something. These little cylinders that would swoosh around Paris and you could send messages to people. Did you know about that?
No, I didn't. I know that they were in buildings, back in the day.
So interested. Yeah. So just, it's full of little period details like that I love. And she's also trying to find out more about him through the people that know him. And so she's tracking back through his family. She's speaking to people who worked with him. She goes to Ireland and she's trying to speak to people who knew him there. So you get all this detail about the mechanics of how you go about researching a biography. And you wouldn't think that was particularly interesting. When I was reading it, when I first started, I felt a bit like, I'm not sure this is going to be that interesting. I didn't really know that much about Beckett. I didn't really understand the significance of what she was doing. But gradually, I got drawn in. And one of the things that's consistently engaging and fascinating about it is, as a young woman, she has to overcome so much misogyny and this horrible world of these fiercely competitive and totally full of themselves male Beckett scholars who are not prepared to let her in. They don't want her there, treading on their patch. And even Beckett himself seems pretty ambivalent about it. So she has to navigate all of this stuff. And she, above all, is a consummate professional. She is totally scrupulous and every interaction is documented. She is incredibly thorough with every single thing that she researches. She's persistent. She doesn't give up on things. She follows up every lead. She goes to enormous personal cost to make the time to get to these places, to go and see these people and to persuade them to part with letters or conversation or, accounts of something. Every time anyone tells her anything, she won't use it unless it's been verified separately by, I think, at least 3 other individuals who were aware of it. Those are the kinds of standards that she sets herself. You can't call it gossipy. She would never gossip. But there is enough detail in there that's quite colourful about the way that people behaved with her, about the way that there was sort of this double dealing going on behind her back and the kind of machinations behind the scenes to try and stop her, and the way that she's managed to rise above all that. And meanwhile, there's her family. She's got 2 children. She has a husband who is a museum administrator. So one of the things she grumbles about a lot, which I thought sounded really glamorous and fun, was that he was always having to do these big museum events, so like these kind of quite glitzy gatherings. And she would have to go in her role as wife to chat to the wives while all the men were sort of having the important conversations amongst themselves. And she grumbled about it like anything. I thought it sounded quite nice.
Maybe the other women weren't quite as accomplished and interesting as her.
No, and also I just think I've been in lockdown too long. I'm just even reading about any kind of party. I'm just like, oh, it sounds brilliant. So in the end, she writes her biography and it's published. And then the middle section of the book is about the fallout from that, I suppose. Mm. I think it was a sensation when it was published and it was a very successful book. But in the academic world, there was this huge suspicion of it and resistance to it. The thing that people were saying about her was that the only way she could have got all this first-hand information about Beckett was if she had been sleeping with him. God. And that was the thing that was consistently thrown at her. Mm-hmm. And, in her way, as you've come to know by this point, she never responded. She never dignified it with a response. She just let the work speak for itself. She also continued to attend conferences where she wasn't particularly welcome. People were really mean to her, but she felt it was important to go and defend the work and promote the work and to stand by it, and that little by little that would, that would prove its worth. Exactly. And so by this time, I just want to stand on a chair and cheer for her. I was so invested in her and her project. And it's really interesting because, as I say, it's written in quite a dry, slightly formal style. It's not this kind of incredibly immersive, gossipy, engaging book, but the subject matter is so riveting and the way that she tells it is so excellent. I think that's the best way to describe it. It's just so well written. The quality of it just comes out of every line, and it was just such a pleasure to read. And then she has a very different relationship with Simone de Beauvoir, who she again approached feeling that the people who had previously written about her had often been male, and they were primarily interested in her relationship with Jean-Paul Sartre and in her sex life. And Deirdre Bair approached her and said, I want to write about your work. I want to write about your ideas. I want to write about your feminism. And she loved that and welcomed that. But she had a different problem with Simone de Beauvoir in that she had to then avoid being her mouthpiece. I loved her. I loved being in her world. I loved learning about her work. I loved reading about the battles that she was fighting and the way that she conducted herself. As you'd expect from someone who worked on a biography of Simone de Beauvoir, it's full of feminism. But it's that show, don't tell, it's all in there, but she's not necessarily going on and on about it. It's just present in her outlook and her philosophy and her work. And then at the end, I think the one thing that I was slightly disappointed by is that because there'd been so much about how the Beckett book was received, I was hoping for the same about the de Beauvoir book. And in fact, it ends with Simone de Beauvoir's funeral, which happened just as Bair was finishing the book. And so she had to rewrite it. So she went back and started work on it again. And so, years and years. I think the Beckett book took 7 years, Simone de Beauvoir 8, something like that. I would have loved to know more about how that book was received. But in fact, then she stops there. And then you just get this concluding chapter, which has some thoughts about the work of biography and what is meant to her. I was loving the book so much. And I just thought, I could read another whole book on this. I didn't want it to end. But I thought to myself cheerfully, oh, well, perhaps she'll write something else. Maybe there'll be another one. And then I looked her up afterwards. I was just curious to know how old she was. I thought, oh, she must be quite old by now. And I Googled her and I found out she died just a couple of weeks ago. She was 84 and she'd lived a long life. She produced many other biographies. She wrote about Anais Nin. She wrote about Al Capone. She wrote about Jung. And I just thought, I was so happy to have experienced this book. It was a really, really, really wonderful read. I loved it. It was just rich and enriching, and I loved it. I'm kind of inclined now to go off and read the Beckett book, but I think it's out of print.
When was she writing?
Oh, good question. I'm not really good at dates. 70s? Yeah, she's talking here about being in Ireland, the 6 months of 1973. So early 70s.
I ask because my next read, Miss Iceland, is a perfect complement to that. It is set in 1962 in Reykjavik, and it is about Hekla, who is a young writer. She always wanted to be a writer, and she has recently moved to Reykjavik to work. I think she's about 20, and she is writing all the time, every moment she can. And yet no one knows she's a writer other than her closest friends and family, because women aren't writers in Iceland. And in a country of 175,000 people, poets are revered, but poets are always assumed to be men. For a woman to write is just not the done thing. And so Hekla will walk past these cafes. They sound like the cafes of Paris in a way, but on a much smaller scale. And she'll see the poet sitting and holding forth. And many of these poets are very well known and household names because they have this great literary tradition in Iceland, of which I knew nothing before I started this book. Others are aspiring poets, right, who want to be a part of that community. But Hekla can't go in there. She will not be welcome. She will be ostracized. And at every moment in her day-to-day life, she is being put back into this place of femininity and domesticity. She's very beautiful. The book is called Miss Iceland because when she arrives in Reykjavik, she is approached by an older man who says, I run the Miss Iceland competition. You must compete. You must be a part of this. It will be incredibly glamorous and you'll get to travel to New York and you'll see the world and this is your opportunity. And throughout the entire book, this is a bit of a spoiler, but Hekla has no intention of entering the Miss Iceland competition. She has no intention of taking this opportunity. She is a waitress by day, and then she is writing in every other hour she has. As a waitress, the sexual harassment is nonstop. The expectations among management are this is just the norm. Like, of course, you can't protest or complain. You know, this is a part of the job. And so she's living at a time in the 1960s where around the world, things are beginning to change for women somewhat. And she is following those conversations, even around like the civil rights movement in America. But she is in Iceland in a time where there is no change. And this is Hekla's story, but actually we are not really taken into her internal monologue. The writing, I loved it. It's so crisp and objective and perhaps similar to the writing of Parisian Lives, where it's this very clear, articulate voice describing what they see. And now this is fiction. So when she's describing what she's seeing, she's never reporting on it from an emotional perspective. However, she has two confidants, her two best friends, and they are vividly realized because they confide in her and they are both having their own personal struggles, which are truly heartbreaking, actually. Her very best friend is John, and he too is now in Reykjavik, and he is working on the fishing ships and going out to sea for long periods of time in the icy cold. He's also gay, and this is a time in Iceland where to be gay is to be ostracized. I mean, that was true all over the world, but particularly there, he is forced to the periphery of society. He is recognized as gay, and so therefore he is abused on these ships, or he is taken advantage of in clandestine encounters. All he wants is to find someone, a man who he can love, and what he's getting instead is these abusive encounters on like the outskirts of Reykjavik. And he's desperate to leave. He wants to be a costume designer. And whenever he returns from these foreign ports, where I should say he's watched like a hawk because his shipmates realize he's a flight risk. So, he'll land in Hull in England, a glamorous port town, and he will find these fashions and bring them back for Hekla. And for a period of time, they're living together and he's dressing her and she's writing and he's using his sewing machine. And there's this kind of loving domesticity that's incredibly touching. The other friend is Issy, and she is a young mother who moved to Reykjavik when she became pregnant with her first child, and she married the father of the child at the same time. And whenever Hekla goes to visit her in their basement flat with her 1.5-year-old, Issy is just a stream of consciousness telling her all her thoughts about her new life and how she loves her baby and how she's miserable and how she couldn't bring up the energy to go and get the laundry from outside and now it's frozen. And she is a writer too, but her husband can't see her write. And if he ever sees her writing in a notebook, he will ask her what she's doing and tell her that she shouldn't be doing that. And he's a good man, but there's just these expectations. She keeps having these dreams that she's going to have more babies. And as the novel unfolds, she does become pregnant with her second. I realize this sounds quite bleak, and yet it's very beautiful. And it's not bleak at all in some ways. Like, it's not a hard read. I think the reason that is because we know that society is going to move on and things will change. And in Parisian Lives, we get to see that transition, I suppose, right? Because it's over decades. Whereas here, it's like a sliver of time in these lives of these three young people when they're really struggling. I haven't read a book that has ended with such a sucker punch in a long time, where I finished the last paragraph and went, oh, it wasn't that it was devastating, but it was surprising. And then I've just kept thinking about it. I love this book. I have been texting all my fellow reader friends and being like, this is so good. You have to read it. This is so good. You have to read it.
Great. It is out here because I had an exciting trip to a real life bookshop the other day. I went to Waterstones in Westfield in White City in London. Just the most horrendous commercial shopping centre you could possibly imagine. But the saving grace was this Waterstones, which turned out to be absolutely brilliant. I walked in and it was such a fantastic edit of books, and it was spacious and welcoming, and everywhere I looked there were brilliant selections of things, and they'd got a lovely translated fiction wall that they'd done, and in the middle, front and centre, was Miss Iceland. I was like, oh, that's that book Laura's reading. So it's out here in paperback.
And it was one of those really exciting surprises where I picked it up at the local library in downtown Vancouver. And a librarian, had kind of cherry-picked it and put it up on that display of like new fiction in translation. And it just caught my eye. I think that's partially why I loved it so much. We've talked about this, but when you make a discovery all yourself and there's real serendipity to it, you just feel so lucky and kind of swept up in that experience. I want to read more by Ólafsdóttir because she seems to be a national treasure.
If librarians like it, then it's highly likely that it might one day win the Dublin Literary Award.
Yes.
My favourite prize.
Yeah, it may well.
As voted for by librarians around the world.
What's your final book?
It is the latest instalment in Deborah Levy's Living Autobiography series. So people may well be familiar with Levy's fiction. Hot Milk, I think we've talked about on the podcast before, haven't we? The Man Who Saw Everything, I think, was her most recent one, which I read and liked, but didn't love. I found it quite complicated and I couldn't really engage with the main character. I never really was able to care about him very much, so that I just never really got very invested in that story. So I find her fiction a little bit problematic. But when I read her first one of these autobiographies, Things I Don't Want to Know, I was immediately hooked from the first page. I just loved her voice and I loved the subject. And with each of these books, she's taken a different point of inspiration. So with Things I Don't Want to Know, I think it was George Orwell's essay on writing. And she is looking at events that were happening in her real life at the time. She was unhappily married, and in fact ultimately that ended in divorce. She chose to divorce her husband, and she did see it in terms of winning freedom to write, freedom to live without the domestic commitments that come with family life and motherhood, and that wasn't an easy choice. It was a very difficult choice. It was very kind of hard won, and in The Cost of Living, she's processing that decision, isn't she? She goes on a writer's retreat, she travels and reflects back on her situation, but it still felt very much like it was all very immediate and raw, and she was working her way through what it all meant. In Real Estate, she's sort of moved on. It felt more whimsical to me, more playful in a way, almost that she's really settled into this form of autobiographical writing in a way that she doesn't need to please anybody with it now. I don't know whether perhaps with the earlier books she wasn't sure how they'd be received, but with this one it just feels like she's not worrying about that at all. She's just writing what she wants to write. It kind of jumps around in a way that's a little bit disjointed, but it's quite fun. I didn't mind it. She sort of just goes on all these different flights of fancy. The overarching idea is the real estate of the title is a mansion that or a house, actually, not necessarily a mansion, but a house that she's created for herself in her mind's eye. And it's quite grand, and it has things like a lake and a boat and a pomegranate tree in the garden and an egg-shaped fireplace, and it's kind of an amalgam of all these different things that she's seen in places that she's loved and she wants to have for her own. But, there are economic costs to divorce, and she left her big, comfortable family home when she left her husband, and she ends up in a much smaller apartment that is in a block where there, has these sort of very depressing corridors. I think it doesn't sound like it was horrible. In some ways, it sounded like it was quite nice, but I think it's no one's idea of a palace, and her places to write are borrowed sheds from friends, or she rents a shed in this one. And it all just feels a bit temporary. And I think she's sort of considering that and where she's ended up and what has become of her in a way. Oh, it's really hard to describe. As a woman, you're reading it and you understand with this kind of innate sense of knowledge and recognition what she's going through. And you feel for her and you want her to succeed. And one of the things I really like about this is that there is a sense that she's, in some sense, enjoying the fruits of her success. She has become well known. She's had Booker-nominated novels. She's a highly regarded author now who is invited to book festivals around the world. And she goes to Paris on a writer's fellowship with this and lives there for 9 months. And the other thing she's coming to terms with is her daughters, who are younger in the other books, leaving home. And so she's sort of thinking about that idea of home, the empty nest. She then goes to Paris, where she's completely disconnected from her family life and has to sort of make her own place there and what that means. It was so interesting. As I say, it does jump around a little bit, and sometimes I felt like, where are you going with this? But every time I felt a little bit frustrated with it, there would be a line or a paragraph that would grab me again. There's one bit I love where, quite early on, she pulls out, she's got a lot of quotations from other writers and things that she's pulling in. She's talking about the idea of the female character. She's thinking about Leela in the Elena Ferrante novel, when she disappears. I was thinking of Hecate at the crossroads with her burning torches and keys, Medusa with her snakes and fatal gaze, Artemis with her hunting dogs and deer, Aphrodite with her doves, Demeter with her mares, Athena with her owl. Whenever I saw eccentric and sometimes mentally fragile older women feeding pigeons on the pavement of every city in the world, I thought, yes, there she is. She is one of those cut-down goddesses who has become demented by life. And I just love that phrase, demented by life. I thought, God, I feel demented by life. I think maybe Deborah Levy's a bit demented by life, but she's such a glorious writer, and it feels like such a privilege to get to read her thoughts in this way. I just love it.
I listened to The Cost of Living last spring, walking around Walthamstow with my daughter. If I was lucky, she would fall asleep. And we weren't allowed to meet up with people then. So it was just me and my daughter in the buggy. And Deborah Levy, she was like a friend on my shoulder, just letting me into her life and her experiences and her musings. And, it doesn't feel like something that would be so appealing and rewarding. But
I know.
It is.
I know.
It's so good. Yeah. And I would like to read real estate. I'm also just pleased to hear how she's doing. It feels like you're updating me on a friend. I'm like, oh, wonderful. Okay. So she's feeling better about the divorce, and she's...
Yeah, and she turns 60 in this book, and she has the best party, like just the best party. And I was just like, oh my God, I could only dream and hope to have such a great party when I turn 60. I'm sure I won't. I think the one perhaps tiny issue I had with it is that I think her life's pretty fabulous. It just sounds like it.
Yeah. But
she's
she
got
is
a lovely
carving something out that is different for herself, right?
And I think what's interesting is that she's drawing attention to the struggle. Anyone can project any kind of image of their life, can't they? It's very easy to say, oh, look at all these wonderful things we all get to do. But I think her point is that she's fought for these things and she's won them at great cost. Has the cost been worth it? And in this, it felt like that's what she was examining. There's just another little quotation I loved, which is a Goethe one. Of all peoples, the Greeks have dreamt the dream of life best. And I love that idea of the dream of life. And she goes off to Deirdre, I think it's pronounced, a Greek island, and she's got a house there where she's writing. All the time she's writing, I think when she wrote this, she was writing The Man Who Saw Everything. And so it's interesting as well, reflecting on what was going into that book at the time. And yeah, loved it. They're such great books. It makes me want to read the other two again, actually, to really knit them together, because at the moment it all feels a bit fragmented. And also just this time of lockdown, she travels to India, New York, Paris, the Greek island, and then London. It very much is a book that takes you places, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it too.
3 of our reads have a lot in common. Miss Iceland, Real Estate, and Parisian Lives, all about women writers to a certain extent, by women writers, about their experiences as women, but without getting heavy-handed or even political, I suppose, about the misogyny and sexism they face, just stating it as a reality.
We don't do follow-on reads in this show, but I was thinking as you were talking about Miss Iceland, I read a book by Sarah Moss. She lived in Iceland for a year, think, or even 2 years, something like that. And it's a book about her life there. She moved there with her husband and small children. I can't remember why. But she lived there for a year, and it's a book about that and about that experience of living in a culture that's so completely alien. And it was really enjoyable. I liked it a lot.
I've always wanted to go, so I think I have a soft spot for Iceland.
Names for the Sea, Strangers in Iceland it's called. Sarah Moss had long had a romantic fascination with Iceland, born out of reading The Snow Queen as a child and Icelandic sagas at university. In 2009, feeling bored of her middle-class life with 2 children and a respectable job in a small English town, she applied for and got a job at the University of Reykjavik. It turned out to be a tumultuous time for Iceland. The day she accepted, the Icelandic economy crashed and her future salary went through the floor. Halfway through her stay, I can't pronounce that, but that volcano erupted. Most of the travel books about Iceland are written by men discovering their inner Viking, riding bareback across glacial rivers and taking on the locals in drinking contests. Sarah instead lived and worked in Reykjavik for a year, sent her children to local schools, tried to entertain them on winter weekends when the sun rises at lunchtime and sets an hour later, learned to cook with local ingredients, and haltingly made friends. But the book is not just domestic and mundane, it also contains much magic, watching the aurora borealis, visiting the volcano, swimming in steamy outdoor pools, meeting people who talk to elves. Yes, I'd forgotten that. There's a thing in Iceland where they basically believe in elves, and they're kind of everywhere.
Sounds great. Michael Lewis wrote about Iceland and the financial crash in his book Boomerang, the Meltdown Tour, where he traveled to different countries to see how they reacted to the financial crisis. And one of the things I took away from that was his observation that men and women live in parallel in Iceland. And this was his observation. I don't know how true it is, but they're equals in many ways now, but they still live in parallel. And he was talking about how there's very strong female leadership in politics in Iceland. But that stream of society is very separate to what would have been the traditional fisherman's stream. That sounds a bit silly, but fishing was the national livelihood until right before the financial crash, where all these fishermen became financial speculators.
Currency speculators, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a really interesting place. I would love to go. And I would certainly read more by Ólafsdóttir. They're so good. Great books, other than maybe Midnight Library, which, hey, if you want easy read, listeners, dive in and report back.
I think people who love it, and they won't be put off by us grumbling about it. It's fine. I think it'll be fine. That's nearly it for this episode. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, a modern classic that may or may not have become overshadowed by the film starring Anthony Hopkins. But what did my book club make of this Booker Prize-winning novel? Did it live up to our high expectations? Listen in to find out.
And don't miss our most recent show on Selena Godden's novel, Mrs. Death, Mrs. Death. In a mixture of poetry and prose, Godden explores the relationship between the character of Death, who appears as an old black woman, and Wolf, a troubled young writer who agrees to write Death's memoirs. Wolf and the reader are swept into a multi-sensory exploration of death in many forms. But as our guest, Gary Wigglesworth, pointed out, the book is joyfully reminding us to live, live, live. So listen in to find out whether me and my book club agreed.
If you enjoyed this show, check out our website, where you can find our archive of shows to browse through, including episodes on books such as The Costa-winning Mermaid of Black Conch by Monique Roffey. You can also explore our library of book reviews and articles.
If you'd like to hear more from us, sign up to our weekly newsletter, which comes out on Sundays and is full of reading inspiration for the week ahead. You can subscribe via the link in our Instagram bio or on our website, thebookclubreview.co.uk. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at BookClubRVWPod, or email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. Drop us a line and let us know what you're reading. We always love to hear from you.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please do take a moment to rate and review the show and help other listeners find us.
But for now, that's our show. Thanks for listening and happy reading.